Hello and welcome to the Sigma Psi Distinguished Lectureship. I'm Katie Burke, Digital Features Editor at American Scientist. I'm speaking today with Lee Dugatkin. He's a behavioral ecologist and evolutionary biologist at the University of Louisville in Kentucky. Lee, thanks for joining us.
It's my pleasure. I've been looking forward to it.
So for those who are watching the Google Hangout Live, I just have a couple of things to tell people about participating in this Hangout if they want to submit questions before we start the interview. If you'd like to submit questions for Lee, you can go to the right side of your screen if you're in the Google Hangout page. If you don't see a spot there, you can also type them on the event page in Google+. And you can also post questions on Twitter using the hashtag AMSCIGHO, that's AMSCIGHO. So just to get things started, before we get into theory and experiments and the history, what are some just basic, brief examples of altruism?
Well, sure. There's lots of them, and so should we start by focusing on altruism in non-humans? If we do that,
yeah.
Okay, yeah. So if we do that, we've got everything from classic examples like the exchange of food meals in vampire bats, where starving individuals approach other individuals who've got a stomach full of blood, and they sort of solicit them. And if things go well, they get a blood meal. And by saying if things go well, I mean if they have developed a relationship with another individual where they swap blood meals when they're in trouble, then they get what they need to survive the next couple of days. And if they don't, then they're less likely to get it. So there we have a case where they're basically exchanging acts of goodness, what we call reciprocity or reciprocal altruism. And then there are just endless examples of altruism and cooperation among related individuals. The classic ones that people have been talking about ever since Darwin brought this up in the 1850s would be social insects like bees and ants and wasps. You know, if you get too close to a bee's nest, the workers come out. They'll defend the nest potentially with their lives to protect the queen, who's this little baby-making machine. And there, what they're doing is they're protecting their genetic relatives. And then there are, like
Which is called kin selection now.
That's right. That's right. That's called kin selection. And there's a well-developed theory about how this evolves. And then there are the examples from everything from social insects to primates and all in between.
And just going back to the vampire bats, the reason that the blood meals are so important is they actually can starve pretty easily. They use so much energy, right?
That's right. So this is work that Jerry Wilkinson and his team did, and vampire bats, depending on the circumstances, if they don't get a blood meal on the order of every 36 hours, they can starve to death. And that's simply because mammals typically don't fly, and flying requires a tremendous amount of energy. And so if you don't get that, it's sort of like it's why songbirds can starve to death in a single night during the winter. It's because it's very energetic to be a songbird. And if you don't get enough food, then in a very short period of time, you can be in big trouble.
But if you have gotten food as a vampire bat, you actually usually have a lot, right? You're like basically bursting.
Right. So that's important in this system because you've got a vampire bat, you've got a roost of these vampire bats that might be on the order of 12 to 24 individuals, and some of them will they'll all go foraging at night, and some of them will come back with blood meals and some of them won't, and the ones that won't are the ones that are in trouble. And what they need to be able to do is a couple of things. They need to, first of all, figure out who in the nest, in their roost, is likely to be someone who actually has the blood in their gut that they can regurgitate to them. And that's pretty obvious because, as you say, when they come back, their guts are distended. It's clear who's got a blood meal and who doesn't. And the other thing they want to keep track of is who's been good to them and who have they been good to in terms of who do they approach and how do they act if they're the one that's approached. And these are, that's the vampire bats and the honeybees. Those have become sort of literally the classic textbook examples, but there are many, many others. Yes.
And so this idea of how prevalent altruism is and how much it's just preserving your genes, doing kin selection, helping out your kin versus reciprocity or any other kind of altruism has been a topic of huge debate. And it goes all the way back to Darwin. And just after Darwin, there were these two guys, a Russian anarchist, Peter Kropotkin, and yes, Darwin's spokesman, Thomas Henry Huxley, right, who just went at it and had completely different philosophies about altruism. So right, who are these two characters and what did they think about altruism and what does that say about their worldviews and the history at that time?
Sure. These are two incredible individuals, and their characters sort of in every sense of the word. I mean, so for example, Kropotkin, I don't want to get going too much because I could talk to you for hours about Peter Kropotkin, but basically he was a Russian scientist and a Russian anarchist. So he was raised in this fairly well-to-do family that had royal lineage, but he sort of tossed all of that away and became, if not the most famous anarchist on the planet, one of them. But he also was an avid natural historian and a big supporter of Darwin's ideas. But Kropotkin took Darwin's ideas and sort of looked at them through the lens of Russia at this time, which is the mid 1800s to the late 1800s. And so basically what he did from his 5 years of traveling in Siberia and documenting natural history in humans and non-humans was argue that Darwin's theory of natural selection was a monumental insight. The problem for Kropotkin was he thought that the Brits had sort of vulgarized this idea to suggest that competition was the end-all and be-all of the process of natural selection, where Kropotkin thought that he saw cooperation and altruism all over the place in non-humans and humans. And in particular, he thought that kinship did not play an important role. So this is, long before the theory that we talked about before, inclusive fitness theory, kinship theory, had been developed. But he argued that kinship didn't play a role at all. On the other side of the story is Thomas Henry Huxley, who was liked to refer to himself as Darwin's bulldog. He was the person who went around discussing Darwin's ideas. He was sort of the face of these ideas, and Huxley was exactly the sort of person that Kropotkin was talking about when he said, well, what the Brits have basically done is taken Darwin's idea and focused it completely on competition and ignored altruism and cooperation. So Huxley basically argued that the world was, that regardless of what species you're looking at, the best way to see how natural selection operates is to think about gladiator fights, that this was sort of a fight to the death, that there were limited resources, that only some individuals were going to win that fight for those resources. And cooperation and altruism played a very, very small role in Huxley's worldview. The only exception for Huxley was, in fact, occasionally you would see altruism among kin. So it's sort of the exact opposite of Kropotkin's views. And they went at it for quite a long time, and the reason that it mattered more than it might normally matter is that these two fellows were not just good scientists. They were, they were really sort of some of the first quote-unquote rock stars of science. I mean, so Huxley and Kropotkin would fill a theater with 3,000 people who would come out to hear them, not they never debated one another in person, but when either one of them would go into a theater in anywhere from England to around the world, they would draw these huge crowds. And the thing about their work as opposed to the work today is that it was essentially a philosophical debate at that time. And what I mean is that there were no experiments being done. There was no theory being developed. And so what we had were two people who had tremendously different life experiences. So Kropotkin got all of his information on altruism and cooperation from Siberia, and he was steeped on the political end in anarchist theory. Huxley got all of the information that he had, all the data that he had, all the natural history from being a traveler down to South America, like Darwin. He went on a ship called the Rattlesnake, and so he saw sort of a dog-eat-dog world where there was tremendous amounts of competition going on. He came at it from a sort of Victorian capitalist competition drives everything view, whereas Kropotkin came at it from a anarchist, somewhat socialistic approach that cooperation was important. So you tie those together with what they saw in their parts of the world in terms of natural history, and you have these very different camps that form. Now, fortunately, things have developed tremendously since then, and while the arguments are still there about the relative importance of kinship or reciprocity or other things like group selection still exist in the literature, they're much more based on theoretical and empirical work rather than sort of world views. Although I'm not going to be naive enough to say that there's none of that going on. It plays a much smaller part than it used to.
So for the study of evolution of altruism to advance beyond these philosophical debates, it needed some more empirical evidence and testable theories. So how did it get them? Like, there's one really prominent model, Hamilton's model. How do you explain that? Yeah,
so Darwin really first sort of laid out the basic ideas in The Origin of Species, and then people talked about them for a bit. And some people, even in the 1930s and 40s, some of the leading theoreticians, population geneticists, for people who might know the names, Fisher and Haldane and other people, were quite interested in this, but they, for the most part, they just dabbled. It wasn't a focus of their work. They came up with some verbal models. There were some preliminary mathematical models, but that's sort of the status of where it stood for a very, very long time. And then in the early 1960s, the first sort of major theoretical breakthrough occurred, which was William Hamilton developing this thing that we've been calling kin selection theory. And the idea there is that it's an extension of sort of classic evolutionary thinking. So another name for this theory is inclusive fitness theory. And the reason it's worth sometimes using that label is that really what Hamilton's model did was make our way of calculating fitness more inclusive. And so what Hamilton basically said was that there are a number of ways that you can get more copies of your genes into the next generation, right? There's sort of the classic way that everybody had been talking about since population genetics and before, which was how many offspring do you produce that survive and reach age of reproduction. The other way Hamilton said that you can get your genes into the next generation was by helping other genetic relatives besides your own offspring, because by definition, when individuals are genetic relatives, they share copies of genes, and in particular alleles that they have inherited from some common ancestor, right? So the reason that you and your cousin are genetic relatives, by definition, is that you share some percentage of the copies of genes that you have from a relative that you both inherited them from indirectly. So in terms of cousins, you share common grandparents. Okay, so it might be on your mother's side, it might be on your father's side, but some proportion of your genes and your cousin's genes are identical copies of something that you got from your grandparents, which means that if you help your cousins, you're indirectly increasing the number of copies of genes in your body that make it into the next generation. They just happen to be sitting in your cousin's body, right? So there are more copies of your genes that get to the next generation. So basically this opened up an entire field of behavioral ecology that basically focused on social interactions among genetic relatives, where we now predict that there's going to be more altruism than there will be in other places. And we also predict that it will be more pronounced and more common the closer the genetic relatives are. So we expect that siblings and parents and offspring will show more altruism on average than cousins will, and cousins will show more altruism on average to one another than, say, second cousins will, and so on. And so you can go out and you can test these models, and they've been tested in everything from social insects to to white-fronted bee eaters, to meerkats, to chimpanzees and humans.
And so, to kind of just summarize Hamilton's model, in a conceptual way, it's kind of like the genetic relatedness combined with the size of the benefit, the amount of benefit you get, both through passing on your genes and whatever direct benefits you might get down the line, like reciprocity,
right,
have to outweigh this cost, whatever cost you're taking on.
That's right. That's right. I was trying. I don't have a whiteboard to write on here, so I was kind of trying to stay away from verbally going through the equation. But I'm happy to. So basically the argument is just what you said, and what it boils down to is this: that anytime you have some trait that has a cost associated with it. So if you're altruistic, by definition, what that means is you're doing things to help others at a cost to yourself. Right? And so for an evolutionary biologist, when there's a cost associated with a trait, then somehow or another, that cost has to be compensated. Otherwise, we don't expect the trait to evolve. Right? So how is the cost compensated? Well, in Hamilton's model and the relatedness model, it's compensated by the benefits that you get by helping your genetic relatives. Now, those benefits are not as great as if you would have helped yourself, because your genetic relatives are not as related to you as you are. So basically, you decrease the benefit by how related you are to them. And if that value, that decreased value of the benefit, is still greater than the cost, then we expect altruism to evolve. And if it isn't, then we don't expect altruism to evolve through kinship. Just to sort of tie it together conceptually with that other path that we were talking about of reciprocity, the same problem exists in reciprocity, which is that always, by definition, altruism means you're doing something to help another individual. So you give up some of that blood meal that you had. That's blood you could have had. That's resources you could have translated into offspring. If you help others, you lose some of that. There's a cost. In reciprocity, the cost is made up in a different way than it's made up in the kinship model. In reciprocity, the cost is made up by the probability that in the future, when you're in trouble and you need the help, you get it. And so there are these different ways that you can make up the cost. And all models of altruism do this in different ways. That's what makes them different, but they all have to do that in order for the trait to evolve.
We got a question from the audience that you've already partly addressed just now. That asks, haven't there been some studies that challenge the idea that genetic connection dictates altruism? Which definitely the concept of reciprocity, of I'll help you now if you help me later, it fits in with that. But are there other ways besides reciprocity and kin selection?
Sure. And my guess is I'm not sure exactly where the question is coming from, but my guess is that when this question is not so much about reciprocity. So the argument I think that they're referring to is the extent to which kinship matters, period. And right. So there has been a very, very heated argument that that has been going on for the last 4 or 5 years about whether kinship matters at any real level, or whether or not they're a better explanation for the evolution of altruism is what's known as the group selection explanation. And so the group selection explanation, just since we're going through these different conceptual models, group selection explanation is that that the cost of altruism is essentially paid by the benefits that accrue at the group level. So in other words, if you have individuals in a group that are being altruistic, for example, they're giving an alarm call when there's some danger around, right? So it's dangerous to them to do that. And how is that benefit compensated? Well, the group selection argument would posit that one way that it can be compensated is because groups with more altruists will outproduce groups with fewer altruists, because those groups, for example, will have more survivors, they'll have more individuals who can colonize, let's say, an open area, an open niche in the environment. And so the cost that individuals pay for doing this in the group selection model is made up by the productivity of the group. This has been and continues to be a fairly contentious argument within evolutionary biology, how important that is. And it can be a fairly technical argument. And I think the debate that this person is referring to comes from a paper that appeared in Nature about 5 or 6 years ago, where Ed Wilson and Martin Novak and others made the argument that group selection explains most of the altruism that occurs in social insects, and that kin selection has been overplayed in terms of its importance. There was a strong response to that, which argued why the respondents thought that was incorrect. But I think we would need about 4 or 5 hours to get into the technical details of that, except to say that, yes, this is an actively debated area. And the nice thing about bringing up this in the question is that now we sort of covered most of the, well, not all of them, but most of the major kind of theoretical constructs that are out there for explaining altruism. Reciprocity is one, and kin selection is another, and group selection is yet another, and there are others, but those are the 3 major ones.
Okay.
Right.
And so a lot of what we've talked about so far is altruism in animals, which is where a lot of this work started. But we see altruism in organisms outside of the animal kingdom as well. Can you talk about some examples? Sure.
I mean, I can tell you about some work we've been doing here on that very topic. So, I would say about 20 years ago or so, this new area in the study of altruism developed, where people began to use microbial systems, single-celled system, single-celled individuals living in massive groups to study this altruism phenomenon. And it might strike a listener as sort of strange to do that, because one way that people think, when people think about altruism, we almost automatically start thinking about intention and causation and basically the cognitive side of altruism. I mean, you've sort of got to keep track of what individuals do. And when you're altruistic, you mean it, you want to help others. But all of those things, to some extent, are an aside, an interesting aside, but an aside from an evolutionary perspective. And from an evolutionary perspective, basically, again, altruism means an individual does something that benefits others at a cost to self. The nice thing about that definition, and we would refer to as an operational definition, the nice thing about it is that you can study that behavior in any organism that can undertake an act to help others at a cost to self. They don't have to have a complex, sophisticated brain. They don't even have to have a nervous system. All they have to be able to do is help others at a cost to self. Okay, so the first real beautiful example of this came from work that John Bonner and others have done for a long time now on these wonderful creatures called slime mold. And so they're single-celled creatures, and what happens is that for certain periods early on in their development, they move around the environment as individuals, totally independent of others. And then the environment changes, and they basically come together and they form a large group of these cells, 5 to 10,000 of them, and that group moves around as if it was really a multicellular organism. It's very, very tightly knit together. And at some point, this massively interesting thing goes on, which is the reproductive stage occurs. And I wish I could show you the video. I know that we were trying to find the links to it before, but basically what happens is the slime mold, the mass of slime mold form these things called fruiting bodies. And what a fruiting body is they sort of look like mushroomy things where there's a stalk and there's a head. And inside the head are the spores for the next generation. And if that gets broken open, the spores spread over lots of distances, and that's how they get into the environment. But the beautiful thing is there's a stalk that holds up what holds all the spores. The stalk is also made up of slime mold cells. And those cells never reproduce. All they do is form a scaffold so that the spores can be in this little capsule at the top and get really high up above the ground, or at least really high from a slime mold perspective, so they can disperse far distances.
So those in the stalk basically sacrifice themselves
they
for
are
the fruit,
going to reproduce.
make it into the fruit.
That's right. They're never going to reproduce, and all they do is provide a benefit to the spores in that capsule. Classic altruism. And there are other systems. So with my colleagues and I, over the last 15 years, we've been looking at altruism in another microbial system, and ours is E. coli. So, what we do is we have these E. coli strains, and the key difference between our strains of E. coli is with respect to how they handle antibiotics that are put into their environment. So we, as humans, typically want to get rid of the bad E. coli, and a lot of E. coli is not nasty to us, but the bad E. coli that causes disease, right? We want to use antibiotics to get rid of them. But from an E. coli perspective, right, antibiotics are the equivalent of predators, right? And you want to be able to protect yourself and at least protect yourself against them. So we have these E. coli cell strains, and one of them are sort of classic E. coli cell strain, which means that they have a set of genes that produce a substance that protects the cell against the antibiotics. And if they have that set of genes, they survive when there are antibiotics around. And if they don't, then they're dead. Okay? We have another strain, and what they do is the ones that can produce the substance that protects them against antibiotics, cells hold on to a good chunk of it, but they also excrete, they secrete out some of that substance that breaks down antibiotics into the environment that they're in. That means all of a sudden that other cells that are near them, even if those other cells can't protect themselves, are all of a sudden protected when there's antibiotics around, if they happen to be near one of these E. coli that secretes some of this substance that breaks down antibiotics. So those secretors are altruists. We know, we've done the experimental work, it costs the E. coli cell something significant to produce this substance. It's called beta-lactamase, and it destroys the antibiotic. It's costly to do that. These cells, the secretors, pay that cost, and then they secrete out some of the protective substance. The other cells near them, some of the other cells might be protected themselves, but some of them may not be protected at all. They may not have the correct set of genes to produce something that will save them. But if they're around the secretors, all of a sudden, they're protected because these altruistic secretors are helping them. So we have been able to do all sorts of amazing experiments that the reason that people got so excited about the microbial system is that, I mean, vampire bats are amazing to study. Honeybees are fantastic, and so are meerkats, and so are chimpanzees. But there's only so much you can do. There's only so much manipulation. There's only so many generations that in your lifetime you can study. But when you work with these microbial systems, right, we can, E. coli, we can look at dozens of generations of E. coli in a couple of weeks. We can do molecular genetic manipulations to change what the cells do, to make it more expensive to produce this substance, to make it less expensive to produce the substance that protects others, to make it so that if you're not protected, we can make it so that you need a lot of altruists around, or you only need a few altruists around. And then we can do experiments where we do competitions between all these different kinds of E. coli cells. And so that's really turned out to be, I think, a bonanza in terms of the kinds of experiments that people have been able to do. Now, to be fair, there's only, this addresses some really important questions in evolution. It doesn't address others, which is, if you happen to be interested in the cognitive evolutionary sides of altruism, in terms of memory and how do we remember who's who and how do we distinguish between altruists and non-altruists, especially the memory side, you're not going to get much from the E. coli work. But if you want to understand the basic nuts and bolts, you are.
Yeah, and that leads into another question very well. One question I had just very quickly, because we've talked about microorganisms, protists, bacteria, animals, but what about do plants ever show altruism? Has that been studied?
There are a few instances of some studies that have been called the talking trees experiments, where people have examined whether or not the substances that plants produce to protect themselves, for example, against herbivores, might in some way be preferentially distributed to relatives. But there's really not much on the plant side of things compared to the animal side and the protein side and all of that. So not nearly as much. Some, but not nearly as much.
Okay, well, it's curious to me because it seems like it could be there.
Well, I think the reason that people have not focused on this to a large extent is even compared to, say, E. coli and other microbes. Certainly plants interact with each other, but the kind of dynamics that we see among animals and in many microbial systems, you don't see that to the same extent in plants. And so there's been the question of sort of how would this play itself out. There are certainly ecological situations in which you might, but I think that another reason I think we haven't seen a lot of this work is that people really aren't, in behavioral ecology, aren't really trained on the botanical end nearly as much as they are on the zoological end. So it's sort of not where their inclinations lead them right away. Doesn't mean that it's not going to be interesting when people do it.
So we have another question from the audience. It's just a quick clarification. They ask, I'm unclear why the E. coli secrete the protective substance. What benefit does it give them to protect surrounding cells? Right.
Okay, so to be clear, in the E. coli example, we have basically experimentally created lines that do the secretion. Okay, so in that particular example, we wanted a model system where we could look at the question, and so we made it so we did molecular genetic manipulations to make them secrete, and then we did the competition experiments. So in that case, they don't normally do that. Other microbes do. Why they do it is a great question. We don't, in the microbial case, like the E. coli ones, sometimes we just don't know. It may be that what drives it in natural systems is that these cells are likely to be surrounded by very, very close genetic relatives. But there are other instances where we do have a better sense of what happens microbial in terms of the microbial altruism. So another classic example, and I'll be quick on this, but just so that people see there are very nice sort of in nature examples of how this happens in microbes. There are a number of microbial systems where the cells, they live on the surface, on the air-water interface. So basically, they want to be on the surface of a standing body of water, okay, because that's where they get their resources best, all right? And what you often see in these kinds of systems are mats, like, like an algal mat, for example, where there are just tens of thousands of cells that are basically stuck together in a mat. And the reason they're stuck together is that the cells literally produce a glue-like substance that keeps them together, which allows the cells to be in a mat that floats so that they can get the resources, that interface. In that system, what people have done is they've introduced either natural or artificial mutants that don't produce the glue that holds the mat together. And what you end up getting is a very, very bad mat. And the mat then tends to sink down to the bottom. And being on the bottom is not nearly of the, in the lake or whatever you're in, is not nearly as good in terms of getting the resources. So if there are enough cheaters who don't produce the substance that holds the whole mat together, the whole system falls apart. And so that's sort of the evolutionary dynamics in those systems. And the E. coli, it probably is being driven a lot by kinship.
Okay, so you started touching on this a couple questions ago, but what are some of the cognitive implications of altruism, and what is being studied to understand better how people and how animals are programmed to be altruistic, to feel empathy, and to have a sense of fairness and morality,
right,
and reciprocity?
Right. So, I mean, if we stick to the non-human example, because as soon as we start talking about humans, it gets very interesting, but it also, we would be, I think we would need to be very careful about using language like a program to do this or that, because the interaction between genetic and cultural evolution is really important in driving human behavior. That said, we know that kinship is also important. So we know that people inherently show preferences towards genetic relatives in terms of being nice to them. But we also know that that's sort of in the context of a very complicated social and cultural milieu. So this is why I think behavioral ecologists really have so much to offer people who are primarily interested in let's say, human cognitive aspects of really pro-social behavior, like what we've been talking about. So the nice thing about looking at it in non-humans is if we can find systems where we can look at fairly sophisticated behaviors that we see in humans, in non-humans, culture plays a role in non-humans, but not nearly the role that it plays in humans. So we can really focus much more on sort of classic natural selection models. And people have done this. So you were mentioning empathy. There's a number of really wonderful studies where people have now been trying to experimentally look at empathy in non-humans. And one of the classic ones that I often like to show videos of deals with empathy in rats. And so there's an experiment that's made the rounds now where what the investigators did was they had a couple of rats who had lived together for a while. They weren't relatives. They lived together, and they had dozens of these pairs of rats that had been living together. And
just housemates.
They're just right. They're just cage mates, and there's 2 of them in the cage, and there's lots of these cages. And so, and what they do after the individuals have lived together for a while is they put them in a new place, and one of them is allowed to roam around free, and the other one is trapped inside a little plexiglass box. And the one trapped in the plexiglass box doesn't like it very much. It can't move around very much. It's not in true physical pain, but it's clearly very dissatisfied about being in there. And we know this because they give off these ultrasonic calls that have been looked at in other contexts and are distress calls. It's what they do when they're in trouble, right? So the question was, and so they're trapped in these little plexiglass boxes that the investigators built. And the catch is that you can't get out of that box through the door that's a part of the box from the inside. The only way the door can be opened is from the outside. And the question then was, do the rats on the outside, who know the rat on the inside now fairly well, do they do anything to try and figure out how to open up the door and free their cage mate? And the answer is that they do. It takes a while. I mean, it was designed to be a difficult task for them to figure out how to open up the door from the outside. And it is. It takes them a long time to figure it out, but they stay focused on it for large periods of time. And eventually they open up the door, and they continue to do this as they're placed back in there over and over. Every time they get placed in, they'll open up the door and free the other rat. Now, the thing about the experiment that makes it so nice is that they ran a bunch of control experiments where they ruled out all sorts of alternative explanations. So, for example, they were really creative, and they did things like they put no rat inside the little box that has the door on it, and they took one of the rats from their pair and they put them in there, and they just wanted to see, would that rat still want to try and open up the door, because opening up a door is something to do, and you're in this, they're in this arena, and there's not a lot for them to do. At least trying to focus on opening up a door is something, and rats like to be doing something. They don't try and figure out how to open the door, and they never open it up. And they do all sorts of these clever control experiments, ruling out alternative after alternative after alternative. And to date, the best explanation for what was going on was that the rat on the outside was trying to open up the door and free the rat on the inside. There remain a lot of sort of questions that we don't know the answer to, but so far, that's the best explanation that we have for why they're doing what they're doing. And there was another experiment that came out shortly after that sort of is even a more intense version of the rat empathy experiment. This time, they actually put the pair of rats in a situation where one of them was in serious danger. So they basically were in danger of drowning. Rather than being in a box that's sort of uncomfortable, the rat that was in trouble was drowning. Now, that adds a whole other layer, because first of all, now there's real danger to the individual who needs help, but there's also real danger to the individual who does something to try and help them. You're not going to hurt yourself if you open up the door. Maybe, if you spend some time trying to figure out how to open the door in the first experiment, yeah, it took some energy, but really, what else were you going to be doing? But now, if you try and help a rat that might be drowning, there's always the chance that you yourself could end up getting in serious trouble and drowning yourself. And the rats still do it. And again, the best explanation for it so far is empathy. They're group living species. They gain a lot by being in groups. And so it might be that they have an evolutionary history really does matter to have lots of other rats around. They provide them with all sorts of benefits. And so if your group size gets too low, that's dangerous. Yeah. And there are other kind of follow-up experiments on this as well. But I don't know if we've got time to get into all of those. But
empathetic rats, and they're continuing to be studied.
They are, and there's a recent study done on empathy in voles. I'm sure there's work that's been done on empathy in primates, and so this is an active area. And like a lot of the work that's investigating new frontiers in science, this work demonstrates that sometimes the most difficult thing for an investigator is to sort of figure out what's the right way to ask the question so that the animals can be in a position that they can answer it for us, right? So I think that for a long time people didn't study empathy because there really wasn't this sort of experimental paradigm where you could say, this really makes sense in terms of where you might expect to find empathy and how the animals might be able to demonstrate empathy. So you basically have to set it up so it's possible that you can actually see empathy. You might not, but you have to set it up in a way where at least it's possible that the animals can behave in a way that would indicate empathy. Whether they do or not is what you're testing. But for a long time, people didn't really know how to do it, so it was even possible to find out. And now we do.
And because of that rat experiment, that was
certainly a breakthrough. And I don't know if there was any. There might have been some precedents that didn't get nearly as much attention, but that was certainly a breakthrough experiment.
So, what do you see as? And this is going to kind of be my last big, broad question. What do you see as the cutting edge of studying the evolution of altruism? What do you see people working on? What are you working on? What do you think is exciting right now?
Yeah, I mean, so we're with my colleagues and I, we're doing work on this microbial system, but I think the microbial work is one place that you're going to see a lot of very important work come out. I think on the other end of the spectrum is sort of the more cognitively sophisticated stuff we've talking about. So I think that the work on empathy, for example, is just starting. The work on a sense of morality and justice in non-humans is just getting off the ground. I think that there's going to be a lot more experimental work done there. And I think in the long run, what's going to happen is that behavioral work, the kind of things we've been talking about, are going to be much more directly tied to things like the underlying mechanisms that are involved. So for example, people are beginning to try and understand the way that various hormones and neurohormones are associated with altruism. We are doing brain scans of humans in situations where they can display altruism or not. We're beginning to do these brain scans on non-humans. It's still difficult practically to figure out how to do that in a way that the animals behave in anything like a normal way. But that's just a matter of time. It's just a matter of time before, instead of having to stick dogs into MRIs to watch brain activity, we're going to be able to have a chip that we can place on the forehead of the animals. I mean, I'm talking, far into the future, but I mean, we already have these little helmets that can be placed on babies to do brain scans, and you can place them on animals, except they don't really behave normally. But what I'm saying is, in the long run, right, it's just a matter of time before that gets miniaturized and we have a system where we can really do brain scans, and then we can do all sorts of amazing things to look at the areas of the brains that are involved, and then we can do things and ask, like, well, if we see these sophisticated behaviors in chimpanzees, in vervets, and ground squirrels that we see in humans, are we actually seeing the same areas of the brain being active, or is it sort of completely a different path in terms of the brain activities that we see in non-humans? We don't know. So I think that's where a lot of the exciting work is going to go in the future.
Cool. So we also just got one last question from the audience too. They said, Dr. Dugatkin said that a benefit of studying altruism in single-celled organisms is being able to observe the changes across generations more rapidly than with, say, mammals. Does rapid generational cycling suggest possibly faster evolution of altruistic traits?
Certainly, and yeah, for the same period of time, if you have more generations going on, then you certainly have the potential for natural selection to act more quickly. And then the microbial systems also allow us to sort of manipulate how intense that pressure is, so we can make it really deadly and really necessary for individuals to have altruism, or less so. And that's another way we can sort of speed up or slow down the process. If the questioner is interested just in that phenomenon in general, the best thing they could possibly do is go to Rich Lenski's website. So it's Lenski. So Rich Lenski has this amazing 64,000 generation experiment that's been going on in E. coli, where they have been, looking at real time more generations than I think modern humans have been on the planet. They've been looking at it in E. coli just over the last 25 years. So, and they're not obsessed with altruism the way that some of us are, but that's one of the things they look at.
Also on that note, is there any sort of study of in what environmental contexts altruism tends to arise or be favored?
Well, I mean, sure, that plays a big part in virtually, I would say, any study of altruism, right? So, and the way that it'll happen would be, it depends on what kind of altruism you're looking at. So, for example, if you just think about the kinship altruism that we've been talking about before, as soon as you start thinking about the way that kin selection might operate, you're really thinking environmentally. So, for example, you might not, you might look in systems where siblings and young a clutch are together in the same spot for very long periods of time, rather than situations in which, let's say, you have a species where they're producing one or two offspring that aren't necessarily interacting with each other all that much, or in a more big scale, individuals really aren't interacting with their relatives very much. So all of those are kind of environmental factors that you would look at. And there's another way, which is that generally people think that what the environment is, for lack of a better word, harsh, where resources are scarce, we tend to think that altruism might be more strongly selected, because you oftentimes need individuals to work together in order to get the scarce resources that are out there.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, we've got to wrap things up, but I wanted to just spend a moment thanking you for
my pleasure,
for coming and talking to us, and good luck with all of the research.
Thank you.
Good luck with the altruistic E. coli.
Yeah, we can use it. Okay, thank you.
All right, bye-bye. Bye-bye, Lee.
Bye-bye, my pleasure. Bye-bye.